Okay, thank you all for joining us today. This is Ask the Historians, and this is the monthly virtual program that we do from Oak Park River Forest Museum, talking about lots of different elements of the history of our community, and thankfully with two very special guests today joining me on the call. So we will be talking about some aspects of the history of the junior high middle schools in Oak Park. I should refer to them now as middle schools because they've been middle schools for 20 years, but they have a long history of being called a couple of different things, and we'll go through a little bit of that today to give you a sense. So I want to start off by introducing our very special guests, Paul Rubio and Dorothy Reid, who are joining us to talk about especially some of their firsthand experience of being part of some very particularly special classes in the history of the junior highs, middle schools. And they'll be sharing some of their personal knowledge of experiencing that history firsthand. So we have Dorothy Reid, who was in the first graduating class at Emerson Junior High, and Paul Rubio, who was in the first ever sixth grade class at Julian Middle School. And I'm going to start off today's program with just a little bit of background history, because especially with the name changes, you're going to hear me refer to the schools in a couple of different names, and that depends on the time period. So I want to give everybody a sense of being able to follow along with those changes. So I was trying to learn a little more about the timeline of these particular schools, the grade schools in Oak Park, the name changes and the grade levels. And I realized that, as always, it's complicated. So I'm going to start with the beginning of the school district here and focus on two elementary schools, one of which was South School and the other was 64th Avenue School. So 64th Street School, sorry. You will maybe recognize 64th Street as Ridgeland Avenue. So that school in the early 1900s became Hawthorne, and the other became Emerson. In the early 1900s, all of the schools in Oak Park were renamed for authors, famous authors. So we have Ralph Waldo Emerson and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Emerson being on the west side of Oak Park and Hawthorne on the east side. Then I'm going to fast forward to the 70s here, because after many years of discussion about creating junior highs in the school system here, I didn't mention that the elementary schools prior to this point were all kindergarten through 8th grade. So after many decades, many different discussions about breaking off into junior high years, then in the mid-70s, we get these two elementary schools being chosen to be converted into junior highs, incorporating 7th and 8th grades. And my next slide is going to give you a little bit of a rundown of the name changes here, because I'm going to go through these a little bit fast as well. I want to also mention that my catchy title here today, Meeting in the Middle, refers to the fact that these two schools were chosen to be converted into junior highs because of their placement in the middle of town. They're both along Washington Boulevard, east side and west side. And so their school district borders both incorporated students from the north and the south side of town. So I hope to get into this a little bit more in the program today, but There were many reasons for that, including not only preparing students for high school a little bit more with the transition, but also to incorporate a little bit more equity and diversity in the student bodies of this age range. So meaning that students from both the north and the south side of towns would come together for this student body. But I'm gonna fast forward here again to mention just in the 1990s, Hawthorne Junior High School was renamed in honor of our profound local scientist, Percy Julian. So we get Julian Junior High. And then starting in the late 90s into the early 2000s, both of these schools were then incorporating sixth grade. So that's where we get to Paul's story especially, and that is where we get these becoming middle schools. At this point in time, Emerson is renamed for author Gwendolyn Brooks. So now we have Brooks Middle School. And that is my little bit of rundown of things, and I hope you all caught some of that. So I'm going to move on here to show you a picture of Emerson Junior High, and I'm going to ask Dorothy Reid to take the floor from me because I want you to talk about your experience starting off as an 8th grader in this new school, Emerson Junior High.
Okay, so thank you first for inviting me to participate in this. It's rather interesting to go back and look through history. I was, yes, at By School Elementary, planning to graduate from there as my older sister did, and unfortunately, they decided to change the program. If you're looking at this picture, the right side of the picture is that is the northeast side. If you go up and over, and I don't know if you can see my arrow, but if you look to the back of that, past away from those trees, is back where By School was. Yes, up and over, thank you. And so this section on that end, when we were in junior high, they had sections, 7-1, 7-2, 8-1, 8-2, 8-3. My section was on that end of town, and I came from the north side of Oak Park By School, went into this end of the building, that's where all my classes were, never saw the rest of that building. Never visited because it was only 1 year. The junior high, from what I remember, there was a lot of, and of course I was a junior high student, so this wasn't really in my purview, but when I later became a board member on District 97, heard a lot of this about the junior high was kind of a wasteland for kids. Parents weren't engaged because they didn't have much time invested in the school. They didn't know the principals, didn't know the teachers. They were only there for 2 years and then they went off to the high school. And I think that's part of the discussion as to how the middle schools came to be. I was on the board for District 97 when we went to middle schools. There was a lot of discussion about having 5th graders who are mentally and emotionally a little different than 6th and 7th graders, and how they were going to integrate that into the programs. I also, as a student at By School, in possibly 4th or 5th grade, was asked to serve on a selection committee to choose a new superintendent for District 97. And if my memory serves me correctly, there was a student from each school, because they were really changing the program, going from K-8 to K-5 or K-6. And so they had young people that came and participated. That was probably 30 or so years ago, so my memory's not really good. the strongest memory I have is that it gave me an opportunity, one, to get out of school. But I did sit around with a bunch of adults and have conversations about what the school system was like and what it was going to look like. Moving to the junior highs, like I said, I was or middle schools. I was on the board when that was happening, and that was also changing the educational system was changing as far as how you were teaching, and junior highs weren't fitting anymore. I know in Rachel's comment, she also mentioned that the two were in the middle, but I think these two, Emerson and Hawthorne, were also two of the bigger schools. And so it made sense to bring that larger population into there. The challenge with Oak Park had always been diversity within the schools and trying to make sure that they maintain that diversity. I can remember as a young person them changing the boundaries for some of the schools. And in fact, when Emerson Junior High was created, I attended Emerson. I lived on the 300 block of Ridgeland.
Yes.
Hawthorne was on the
400 block.
400 block South
Ridgeland.
Ridgeland.
Yeah.
So it would have been closer for me to go to Emerson, but the racial diversity caused me to go to Emerson. Mm-hmm. Also, they bused the students there, and being an African American, I did not want to get on a bus to go to school. One, my mindset was I'm healthy, I can walk. It was also interesting because I lived on the 300 block and I had friends, both Black and white, who lived on the 100 block, Kyler and Elmwood, and neither one of them got to get bused. So I was the last stop. I'd heard stories, horror stories about bus rides to school. I wasn't doing it. So I walked from 300 block Ridgeland to Emerson. I picked up my two friends on Kyler and Elmwood, and the three of us walked to school every day. And again, only went in that one end. I think I've covered just about everything.
And so what was the feeling like of being the first graduating class there?
We were not thrilled. We want to graduate from our school, which we had attended. I had attended since kindergarten. There were new teachers that we had to get to know. Some of them we knew because they came from our previous school, but some of them didn't. There were new kids, obviously. We'd been in school with the same friends since kindergarten. I personally was involved in swimming, track as a youth, so I knew people from all different schools and all different sides of Oak Park, so it was probably less of an impact to me than it might have been for someone who didn't participate like that. Mm-hmm. Likewise, when you went to the high school, it wasn't as big of a building. There weren't really 4,000 students there. There were only however many you knew in your class, plus whatever else you ran into. But it did make it a little easier to go into the high school, although I had plenty of experiences in the high school prior to that. From swimming, we'd have swim meets there, track meets there, summer school I took at the high school. So I was exposed to that, but oftentimes it's that big building that kind of intimidates people.
Absolutely, especially as a young student. And I hope
Yes.
that even though when you're that age and your world is your school and the people that you see at school, I can imagine what a disappointing experience it would be to have such a new environment for your last sort of celebratory year of elementary school. But I do hope that nowadays, especially, and with your involvement with all different aspects of the school board and changing all of these good changes, I hope you have a good perspective on this decision, especially just the fact that this happened in Oak Park. Now,
Yeah, and
with perspective, it seems like a good thing.
it seems definitely like a good thing. And actually, as the COVID thing is going on, I could kind of empathize with those people who didn't really have their full junior year, their full senior year. They didn't get prom. So I understand life changes, life happens, and it's not good or bad. But I think that definitely the way the district changed and implemented the things that were necessary. Again, their big piece was diversity. That was the biggest piece, was driving the boundaries and the schools. And as I said earlier, I went to Emerson, now Brooks. Instead of going to Julian was closer, but now that has changed. And so the people who live on my block, where I live now, or grew up on Ridgeland, now go to Brooks.
Mhm.
So they're constantly evaluating what the demographics and the numbers are as far as the neighborhood and the community.
Amazing. Well, thank you. I want to move on here to give Paul the floor and talk about a little bit of your perspective as this next point of transition from the schools being 7th and 8th grade to, for at this point, more than 2 decades, they had been 7th and 8th grade. And then in the early 2000s, then incorporating 6th graders. And with you being part of that initial group of 6th graders, now I want to have you share some of your perspective on that.
Well, thank you again, Rachel, for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this presentation today, because this is a story that really means a lot to me personally. So I, just by virtue of, when I was born and how I ended up going through school, I was part of the very first group of students to attend 6th grade at Percy Julian Middle School. So it was interesting that I went through Irving Elementary School thinking I was going to be there until 6th grade, but then starting to get into the later years of elementary school, I started hearing adults talk about this change that was coming. There's going to be these 2 new middle schools in Oak Park. And it just so happened that my group was going to be part of that first group of 6th graders. So instead of getting to the top of the school in 6th grade at Irving, I went from being second at the top then to being back at the bottom for 6th grade. But I guess it was a unique opportunity to be part of this experience of going to middle school and blazing a new trail for all those who have come since. So I think we can maybe hit to, so just want to point out on this slide, that all the way on the right side is actually the inside cover of the yearbook that was made for during my 6th grade school year, so the 2002-2003 school year. And the theme they decided to give it was New Beginning, because this was the first year that the building was fully completed and had 6th, 7th, and 8th graders in it. So construction, I believe, started back in the early 90s or around 2000. And we can maybe go to the next slide, Rachel, to sort of give these visuals of how this unfolded. So we can see on the left side, this is a really good diagram that shows how Emerson Junior High School then became Brooks Middle School. So the original Emerson school building was kind of in the middle of the block, this block. And the first phase was to build the area around to the north, so that phase one, those 2 darker areas, those were constructed first while students in 7th and 8th were meeting in the Emerson school building. And then once the dark areas in the north and south sides were completed, then the process underway to demolish the original Emerson school building and then join the 2 halves together. And that actually meant that students, this is something I heard especially from family friends who had 2 daughters I had a daughter at Emerson. While the 2 pieces were being joined together, students actually had to exit the building, go through a covered walkway, re-enter to get between the 2 pieces while being joined together.
Wow.
Now, over at Julian, which appears on the right side of the screen, it was a little bit more straightforward, not as involved in the same way. So the lighter shaded area was the original Hawthorne, then Julian school building that was right along Ridgeland Avenue. And what happened was the east side of the current Julian building was built, and that includes these two team wings. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Were built in addition to some other areas like the gym. And then once that was completed, then there was the 2001-2002 school year that was used by 7th and 8th graders. And in fact, my brother started at 7th grade at in the half-completed Julian Junior High School building, while the other part of the building was being constructed that had the auditorium, the Commons lunchroom, and library media center. So first the old building, old Julian / Hawthorne building was torn down along Ridgeland, and then the second half of the current Julian building was built there. So construction was completed by the summer of 2002, and then I started 6th grade on Tuesday, September 3rd, 2002. And not only was I starting at a new school, starting 6th grade, I was basically making Oak Park history as one of the first group of 6th graders to go to this new middle school. And I guess this would seem kind of natural going to a new school. There was a lot of jitters I experienced, and it was a little bit nerve-wracking for me, but I also had this sense that something really big was going on, and I came to appreciate that more and more, especially in the years since I graduated from Julian, that I was able to be a part of starting something new that has created this experience that all these students have had since. So I really wasn't in a unique position to have an experience of 6th grade like no one had before me, no one had had since, by starting out this new middle school experience of being at Julian for 6th, 7th, and 8th, even as my counterparts were doing the same thing over at the new Brooks Middle School. And for great variety of reasons, which I could speak about for quite a long time, middle school had a really significant impact on my life. And I think being part of that first group of 6th graders really had a lot to do with it. And I even think, again, speaking back to like this diversity idea that we've been talking about throughout this presentation, I went from my area in the south side of Oak Park to mingling with people from all other different parts of the village. In fact, before I started middle school, I only knew one Jewish person and her family. And then when I got to middle school, I was meeting Jewish people every time I turned a corner, it seemed. And one of my 6th grade teachers, Mr. Brockman, who left a pretty significant impression upon me, talked openly about being a Jewish person, which added a lot of depth to our study of the Holocaust that year. And I got to learn so much more about Jewish people as well as other cultures, and it really helped me appreciate my cultural, religious, ethnic background a lot more. And I also think the genius of the design of the middle schools is having these team wings. And it sort of allowed there to be a sense of community within this large building by organizing the core classes in these actual wings of the building. And so there was, when I was in 6th grade, I had 3 core teachers, and we would have our core classes in this wing of the building, and then we would leave that wing of the building to go to our elective classes for other periods during the middle of the day, and then we come back to our team wing towards the end of the day. And even being in such a big building, I could really appreciate having that sense of community that was fostered by those team wings that then continued on through 7th and 8th grade. And if we want to go to the next slide, Rachel, I want to show something here. So this is the cover of my 6th grade school year yearbook for the 2002-2003 year. And again, it says it's about time that now we have this new building. And the picture on the right is actually from my 8th grade school year yearbook. And the 8th graders had basically this voting where they would pick several different categories, one male student, one female student. And I was selected as the male student who was most likely to succeed. And then Emma Lewis, my classmate, was the female selected for this. And this picture was taken on the 3rd floor, right outside the doors of the library media center. And it looks out into this sort of open passageway that goes from the hallway right outside the auditorium, and it looks directly up to sort of this skylight area. And I remember walking into the building those first few days as a sixth grader, and I would walk through that open area and I look up, and there's actually something very inspiring about that. So even with all the jitters I experienced as a sixth grader, new to this school, trying to get things figured out, there was just something really grand about, I'm in this fresh new building and a part of this really important experience. And eventually I've come to realize this is going to have an impact on generations of students to come, even students who hadn't been born yet. I was making an impact on them by making this experience possible. And then if we go to the next slide, Rachel, we can see that there's really something worth celebrating for this new middle school that had been built. And this is actually a program from the dedication ceremony that was held for Julian Middle School on October 20th, 2002. And I remember actually attending this. And they had all these people speaking, and there was students who performed.
I'm glad I found this too, because we also have, under the Board of Education here, we have our other guest speaker, Dorothy Reid. So you can see your name on there as well. And Dorothy, do you remember this sort of aspect of?
I do, and it's interesting to hear Paul talk about the sense of community, because I know that that was a big part of what the board was trying to achieve in bringing this large cohort of students together, but then how do you give them the experience that they feel special and important and valued within their core. And so, yes, the development of those wings, like he explained, was core to what we were trying to achieve. So to hear how it impacted him is very positive, yes.
And Paul, you mentioned that they still use this system in the school, or a similar system of grouping.
They do. So at Julian, they're called teams. So there's teams like the sixth grade, seventh grade. I think it's, when I was there, was teams 6-1, 6-2, 6-3, 6-4, and then seventh grade had 3 teams, eighth grade had 3 teams. And I believe at Brooks, they use the term core instead of team, but it's a similar concept. And in some ways, it kind of helped to have those teams, because there weren't many people from Irving who were on my team. So that made the adjustment a little bit difficult, because I was hoping there'd be more people from Irving, and it was made very clear there was 4 teams, but it's not going to be one for each of the elementary schools feeding into Julian. So that would also be by Longfellow and Man. But I guess it was sort of not broken up in a way to have a lot of Irving students on my team, but eventually just being that community structure of the team, I was able to make some good friends, especially with friend I remember, Zach, who was someone Jewish. And again, he was part of helping me come to greater understanding of other cultures, religions, ethnicities, people with different backgrounds. That ended up making middle school such a memorable experience for me. So by the time I graduated in 2005, I looked back at a very memorable experience that had not just shaped me, but really defined me as a person in so many ways. And there was a lot to celebrate, being that first group of students to graduate after 3 years at the middle school, in addition to all the personal growth I had experienced. And it's something I still feel is very much a part of me today. And it's great that I have the opportunity to go back to middle school on a weekly basis when I teach middle school students in the religious education program at Ascension Church. And I'm just started my 10th year of doing that. And it's great to reconnect with today's middle schoolers to see how things have turned out, since I had such a pivotal role in getting the current middle school started in their structure.
It's such an important time period in any person's life and development, and to be able to have a good experience in your school with your classmates is so important. So being able to foster that as much as possible in the structure that the schools have taken to be able to do that as much as possible is really amazing to hear. And one
other anecdote I'll add really quickly is that throughout 6th grade, I heard my teachers refer to us as the guinea pigs, like, oh, you're the guinea pig group that you're starting this out. And I know even in 5th grade, our teachers weren't really sure what to make of the idea of sending us to another building instead of just down the hall. And, you know, it's interesting to think, as one of my teachers remarked at one point, when I went back to visit him a couple of years after graduating, not only was it a new experience for me, it was a new experience for them too. So we're kind of going into this together to launch this new experiment that I feel in many ways turned out really well.
Amazing. Very interesting. Well, I think we're out of time here, actually. I want to invite anybody who's on the call to put in some questions. If you have any questions for our panelists today, we can probably take one really quickly if you have one. As I show you all these pictures from at this point in October of 2002, brand new Percy Julian Middle School. And then follow up with my last slide here. If anybody has any questions after today's program, feel free to email me on the email you see on your screen, and questions for the museum or for our presenters today, I can pass along and share as many stories as we can. That is what we try to do here at Oak Park River Forest Museum. And I am so grateful that Paul and Dorothy were able to stop by today and share with me and with us. So
I just have one.
please.
I just have Diane Pelletier. I have a question.
Mhm.
I graduated from what I went to grade school in 1941 at a school called Horace Mann.
Mhm.
Was that still in existence?
Yes.
Yes, Horace Mann.
So when
Mhm. Go ahead, Dorothy.
when they went to the junior high schools, the elementary schools remained as K through 5. So we have 8 elementary schools and 2 junior high schools, and Mann's one of those.
Oh, it was. Is it
Up
still?
on Kenilworth. Yeah, North Kenilworth.
And it's still around today? Is it
Oh,
still?
yes.
I don't, I mean, I live in Palatine, so I don't get to Oak Park very often, but I did go to high school and grade school there, totally. It was so different.
And Horace Mann is still there, yeah.
It was a good experience, but for even for any kid, I was just coming out of school, a few months in a school in Chicago. And even that was a big cultural shock to walking into kindergarten in Oak Park, where they're already ahead of what we're doing. In just those few months, I felt like kind of a Martian or something. It's very different. So I get how sometimes you have to connect with others, and it takes a while.
And really quickly, everyone, I'm just going to put in the chat a link to something that's on my personal blog where I was reflecting on the 20th anniversary starting at Julian. So you are welcome to read that and share that with other people. So that is in the chat.
Oh, that's great.
And I share a little bit more reflection on what it was like.
And I'll put that in a link for the folks who watch this on YouTube afterwards. I'll put that in the description of the video as well, so you can find that later. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I think that is our time for today. So I want to thank Dorothy and Paul again so much for being here today and sharing your perspective on this very interesting history of Oak Park. And
Thank you, Rachel, for coordinating and pulling it together.
so fun.
Well, it
And
was great to participate. Thank you.
and thank you all for attending. So I hope to see you on our next virtual program, and check out our website for more events coming up. And thank you all.
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you. Blessed day, everyone.
Good day.